Mr. Johnson, could you come in? I heard the CEO's voice as I clicked the door open and entered his office. There he was, sitting at the back with a woman by his side. It was his wife, Mrs. Mary Anderson. Seeing both of them looking at me, I got nervous and froze. Then Mrs. Anderson said kindly, "I'm sorry for calling you in so suddenly. I hope we didn't interrupt your work." I quickly responded, "No, no, it's all fine." I had only spoken to the CEO, Mr. Anderson, when I first greeted him upon joining the company. As for Mrs. Anderson, I had seen her around but never spoken to her before. I wondered what both of them wanted to talk about with me. I was a bit nervous, thinking it might be something bad, but then quickly reassured myself with my usual cheerfulness, saying, "It's okay, it's okay." Anyway, Mrs. Anderson continued, while Mr. Anderson remained silent, which made it even more intimidating. "Mr. Johnson, what is your father's name?" Mrs. Anderson asked. My father's name? I was surprised. It's quite rare to be asked about your father's name at work, especially being called to the CEO's office for it. Is there something with my father? I blurted out, somewhat panicked. Then Mr. Anderson, who had been silent, started laughing. "Mary, you're not asking it right. Look how surprised Mr. Johnson is." Embarrassed, Mrs. Anderson looked down a bit and said, "I'm sorry. No, it's not like that. Your first name is Mike, right?" "Yes, my first name is Mike and my father's name is George," I answered her question. Then Mrs. Anderson exclaimed, "Oh, I knew it." And then a shocking truth was about to be revealed. My name is Mike Johnson, a 29-year-old who loves living freely. To be precise, I loved freedom in the past, but now my thoughts have completely changed. The turning point for me was, without a doubt, marriage. Before getting married, I hated being tied down. After graduating from high school, I didn't go to college. Instead, I saved up money through part-time jobs and went abroad. Traveling as a backpacker through various countries was truly enjoyable and meaningful. It helped me break free from the social mindset that I felt constrained by. However, I had a fateful encounter in one country. It happened when I was touring Thailand alone. After eating at a street stall one afternoon, I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my stomach and had to sit down on the side of the road. Thinking it would subside after a short rest, I underestimated the pain, which only grew worse. "I need to see a doctor before nightfall. This is serious," I thought, sweating from the pain. I considered calling for medical help, but I didn't even have the energy to look up a hospital. Just as my vision started to blur, a woman asked in English, "Are you okay?" Lifting my face with the last of my strength, I saw a young woman who appeared to be American looking at me with concern, and an older man standing next to her. "I have a terrible stomach ache. It started suddenly after eating," I managed to say despite the pain. The older man then said, "It might be food poisoning. It's dangerous to leave it untreated. Let's go to the hospital right now." I was in too much pain to respond, and before I knew it, I was being carried to a car by the young woman and the older man and taken to the hospital. After receiving proper treatment at the hospital, my stomach pain subsided and I was out of danger. Since I had to stay overnight, the two who helped me went home, but the young woman came back the next morning to check on me. As I was getting discharged, I expressed my gratitude, saying it was thanks to them I was doing well, and asked for her contact details to thank her later. "Oh, then let me give you my father's business card." Handing me the card, I saw George Wilson, CEO of Wilson Real Estate Co. Ltd. written on it. "Wow, he's a CEO," I exclaimed. As a young man with only part-time job experience, seeing the word CEO made me feel like I was looking up to the heavens. Yes, my father had business in Thailand for a few days, and I came along for sightseeing, she explained. Her name was Sophia Wilson. The two who had helped me were father and daughter. Sophia was a college student a year younger than me. She said she wanted to travel to various countries while she was still a student. Having a similar desire to see the world while I was young, Sophia and I had a great conversation. I learned that Sophia and her father, Mr. Wilson, would be returning to their country in a few days. Although I had planned to continue backpacking, the severe stomach pain had given me a glimpse of the afterlife, so I decided to return to the States soon. After being discharged, knowing Mr. Wilson was interested in fine liquors from Sophia, I consulted my father, who was knowledgeable about alcohol, and ordered some specialty liquor as a thank you for their help in Thailand. I sent Mr. Wilson the liquor and Sophia a gift card by courier. Soon, Sophia contacted me to say thank you and suggested we go shopping together as she didn't know what to buy with the gift card. So we went on a shopping date. Shopping together, Sophia said buying something together makes it more memorable than doing it alone. I was happy and enjoyed the time with her. As Sophia and I saw more of each other, we grew closer and eventually, she became my girlfriend. Not only did Mr. Wilson appreciate the liquor gift, but he also took a liking to me, and with parental approval, Sophia and I began dating and later got married. Now, even though I still believe in a free and unbound lifestyle, I've come to realize that finding stability for a life with the one you love is also a form of happiness. That's why I decided to work for a general company. There, I faced the harsh realities of society. I wanted to work for a well-known company with a good salary for Sophia's sake, but that was a high bar for someone like me with only a high school diploma. Sophia's father, Mr. Wilson, offered me a job at Wilson Real Estate, hoping I would eventually help PR the company. Sophia said, "Why work at a general company? You can always work at my dad's company." But I felt it wasn't right to rely on my father-in-law's connection, having only high school and part-time job experience. Besides, I've always been a man of spirit and energy. I was sure I could get hired by a good company in unfounded confidence. In hindsight, now I realize it was youthful arrogance, a lack of maturity. I went to about 10 interviews and was rejected by 9. That summer, at 22, I learned that enthusiasm alone doesn't get you a job. Should I go to college now? Studying for college entrance exams now, I likely wouldn't make it into a prestigious university. Maybe I'm a loser. Just when that thought crossed my mind, my phone rang. "This is the recruitment department of EMR Corporation. We decided to hire you, Mr. Johnson. Can you start next week?" The woman on the phone said. "Really?" I'd exclaimed in a higher pitch than usual. After getting the details about my first day and hanging up, I shouted yes, and fist pumped. It was a sunny day, and I was at home with Sophia. "You got it. That's great, congratulations," she said, very happy for me. Though she might have preferred me working at Wilson Real Estate, her support for what I wanted to do made me happy. Thank you, Sophia. In the next week, my life as an office worker began. On my first day, I wore an unfamiliar suit and tie carrying a business bag. As one of the many office workers and students heading to the city center on a packed train, I managed to make it to the nearest station. After getting off the train and straightening my crumpled jacket, I walked about 10 minutes from the station to my company's entrance. Heading to the corner room on the second floor as instructed, an employee came and explained what I'd be doing that day. Since it was my first day, I spent the morning watching training videos and the afternoon greeting my department and receiving brief job instructions. "Nice to meet you all. I'm Mike Johnson. Looking forward to working with you." I greeted everyone energetically. At my new workplace, everyone seemed nice, which was a relief. I had a reasonably good start and ended my first day as a company employee on a happy note. The company I joined, E&R Corporation, specializes in managing and maintaining office buildings. The company was founded by Mr. John Anderson and had about 50 employees. His wife, Mrs. Mary Anderson, was working as both the secretary and in charge of accounting. Everyone at the company unanimously said, "Our company has good interpersonal relationships." This was my first time working as an office worker, though I had many part-time jobs in the past where the workplace environment was tense due to human relations. However, this company had a family-like atmosphere where everyone worked lively. Even with my limited experience, I understood that such an environment is rare and fortunate. The company that hired me, a high school graduate, was a godsend. I wanted to cherish this opportunity. At E&R Corporation, I enjoyed a fulfilling company life. I accompanied seniors on business deals to learn about sales talk and even tried my hand at developing new business contacts. Every day was fresh and exciting. My previous part-time experiences involved mostly physical labor, like moving goods and sorting in warehouses, so using my brain more was tiring. But these were skills I wanted to learn, and I was happy to have the opportunity. About 3 months after joining, one day after finishing work and returning home, I stretched my arms towards the ceiling and told my wife, Sophia, "I'm tired, but it was a fulfilling day. Sophia then asked me, tired, huh? Do you enjoy your work? I replied, yeah, there's still a lot I'm not used to, but it's all a learning process, and I find it rewarding. Right, that's good, Sophia replied, but her expression seemed somewhat lacking in energy. What's wrong, Sophia? I asked. Then, with slight hesitation, Sophia said, well, it's just, she seemed to have something on her mind but was holding back, so I encouraged her. I want you to tell me whatever you're thinking. Actually, it seems like my brother has no intention of coming back. Dad is really getting angry about it, Sophia said. Sophia has an older brother who's 4 years her senior. He was supposedly going to take over their father's company, Wilson Real Estate, but that seemed like a vague plan. Mr. Wilson, her father, believed that his son would take over, but her brother Steve seemed uncertain and had not returned since going abroad for study. Originally, after graduating from college, he helped at his father's company. But during his second year of work, he said he was going for a short-term language study in Germany. The plan was for half a year, but he didn't come back even after 1 year, then 2. Communication was barely maintained through email with slow replies, causing worry for the family. Just yesterday, Sophia continued, Dad told my brother, enough is enough. Come back to the U.S. What about the company's succession? But my brother replied, I'm not coming back yet, and that really angered Dad. I could picture Mr. Wilson's angry, grief-stricken face in my mind. Normally, he's a gentle person, but I could sympathize with his frustration. If his only son, who he wanted to take over the company, was being evasive, at the same time, I could empathize with his son's desire to live overseas rather than spending his life working at an American company. Isn't it natural to want to live a life without regrets? As I listened to Sophia's story, sipping on a cold beer from the fridge, her next words took me by surprise, and I almost spat out my drink. So Dad is saying he wants you, Mike, to be his successor, she said. I blurted out in shock, what? I was just a high school graduate who had been wandering abroad as a backpacker. Sophia's brother was a capable elite, a graduate from a prestigious university. He was a far more suitable candidate than me. I was just fortunate to marry Sophia. I wasn't competent enough to take over her father's significant company. It was beyond being flattered. No, that's not happening, I told Sophia. Then Sophia said, that's a terrible way to put it. Do you dislike my father's company that much? Forget it. She looked sad and then locked herself in her room. That's not what I meant at all. It was our first fight. I rushed to her room to explain and clear up the misunderstanding. I didn't dislike Mr. Wilson's company, nor was I disinterested. In fact, being offered the chance to lead such a prestigious company was an opportunity and a blessing. But the feeling that I'm not up for it was strong, and just because Mr. Wilson was upset with his son, it didn't feel right to me to step in. After explaining this to Sophia, she understood, and we made up. 1.5 years had passed since I joined D&R Corporation. I had become quite accustomed to the job, securing new contracts and closing major deals. A senior who trained me as a new employee said, Mr. Wilson himself praised your remarkable growth, which made me really happy. I seemed to be well suited for this job, and my daily efforts were paying off. One day, I had an external meeting in the morning and in the afternoon. After returning to the office, I was checking my emails when my manager came and said, Mr. Wilson is calling you. Please come to his office. To the CEO's office. I was surprised since I had never been called to Mr. Anderson's office since joining the company. I had heard of department heads being summoned, but it was almost unheard of for an employee like me, only 1.5 years into the company, to be called by the CEO. Logging out of my computer, I nervously headed to Mr. Anderson's office and timidly entered, saying, This is Johnson. May I come in? Ah, Johnson, come in, I heard Mr. Anderson's voice. As I opened the door and entered, I saw Mr. Anderson sitting at the back with a woman beside him. It was his wife, Mrs. Mary Anderson. Both of them looked at me, making me freeze up in nervousness. Then Mrs. Anderson said kindly, Sorry for calling you in so suddenly. Did we interrupt your work? I hastily replied, No, it's all fine. I had only spoken to Mr. Anderson during my initial greeting upon joining the company, and this was my first time speaking with Mrs. Anderson, Though I had seen her around, I wondered what they could possibly want to discuss with me. Nervous they might say something bad, I quickly reassured myself with my usual positivity. It's okay, it's okay. About the matter, Mrs. Anderson continued. Mr. Anderson remained silent, making me even more nervous. Johnson, what's your father's name? She asked me. My father's name? I was taken aback. It's not common to be asked about your father's name at the workplace, especially not in the CEO's office. Is there something about my father? I asked hastily. Mr. Anderson, who had been quiet, began to laugh. Mary, you're not asking it right. Look how surprised Johnson is. Embarrassed, Mrs. Anderson slightly looked down and said, Sorry, I didn't mean it like that. Your first name is Mike, right? Yes, my first name is Mike, and my father's name is George, I answered. Then Mrs. Anderson exclaimed, Oh, I knew it. I was completely baffled, not understanding what she meant by, I knew it. Is your surname truly Johnson? Did your surname change at some point? Oh, but it's too personal, you don't have to answer. I'm sorry, Mrs. Anderson said gently. I hesitated for a moment. I'm sorry. As you said, my surname has changed. When I joined the company, it wasn't specifically asked, so I didn't mention having gotten married and taken my wife's last name. Until marriage, my last name was Baker. I responded honestly. When I married Sophia, her father, Mr. Wilson, had planned for his son Steve to take over the company, but he also wanted me to work there, suggesting I should take the Wilson name as part of the family. Changing my surname to Wilson wasn't an issue for me, so I accepted their suggestion. However, I kept my background secret upon joining MR Corporation because I was known as a relative of Wilson Real Estate, which operates in a similar industry. I didn't intend to lie when asked, so I thought it was best to be open about it for the sake of trust. But Mrs. Anderson and Mr. Anderson didn't call me to press about my connection to Wilson Real Estate. They had a different reason, which became clear later in the conversation. Ah, I knew it. I listened to Mrs. Anderson's second, I knew it, which she said in a voice even higher than before. Yes, indeed, you're the one from that time, Mrs. Anderson said. Mr. Anderson added, Yes, just as you thought from that time. I was still completely clueless. Excuse me, I'm sorry, but I have no idea what you're talking about. What do you mean by that time? I asked them, even though it might have been rude. Then Mrs. Anderson began her story. It was 22 years ago. I was pregnant with a child John's and mine. I still had 3 months to go until my due date and was out shopping alone. Suddenly, I was struck with severe abdominal pain and couldn't stand, so I sat down right there. Back then, not everyone carried a mobile phone like today, and I didn't have one. A woman passing by noticed something was wrong with me and approached me. Mr. Anderson was listening quietly, his gaze on the floor. She offered to call an ambulance, but I thought it was too much and asked for a taxi to go to the hospital. So she went to the road to hail a taxi. However, we couldn't catch one easily, and my abdominal pain worsened. While listening to Mrs. Anderson, I wondered anxiously if her baby was safe. She continued, Then a car stopped. The man driving asked what was wrong, and the woman helping me explained that I was pregnant and in pain. He offered to take me to the hospital in his car. I was hesitant to get into a stranger's car, but I was in too much pain to refuse, so I accepted the ride. Hearing up to this point, I couldn't help but blurt out, I'm glad. Mrs. Anderson continued, That man drove me to my usual maternity clinic. I was so grateful that I wanted to thank him later. So when I got out of the car, I asked for his name and contact details. However, he said no need for thanks and didn't give his contact. At least he wrote down his name on a piece of paper for me while I was struggling with the pain. It was George Baker. I was surprised my father, George Baker, had such a connection with Mrs. Anderson. The world is indeed a small place. Mrs. Anderson's story continued. Actually, in the car, Mr. Baker mentioned he was also on his way to a maternity clinic. It was different from the one I was going to, so he kindly dropped me off first. The reason he was going to another maternity clinic was, I interrupted her. Could it be? She said, Yes, it was for your birth. Your mother had gone into labor, so he was on his way there. I told him he should have left me and made sure to be there for his child's birth first. I wouldn't have understood, but he said, I can't just leave someone in trouble. It's fine. My son will wait for me. We decided to name him Mike. He's a smart boy. He'll wait. I felt terrible thinking if he missed his son's birth because of me. Finally, I began to understand. I told Mrs. Anderson, "Thank you. Even if my father hadn't made it to my birth, it would have been okay. Only my mother could give birth, so as long as he met me afterwards, it's fine." Hearing this, Mrs. Anderson looked disappointed and downcast. "So he didn't make it after all. I'm so sorry." I quickly said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to mislead you. Actually, my father was there for my birth. I don't remember it myself, but my father told me all about it, so there's no doubt about it." Mrs. Anderson and Mr. Anderson's expressions brightened, and they both exclaimed, "That's wonderful." Mrs. Anderson added, "We were always curious if Mr. Baker made it to the birth. We knew there was another child born in the neighborhood on the same day, so I thought maybe one day we'd meet little Mike at a playground or something, but we never did." Mrs. Anderson said this and looked sad. I said, "Mrs. Anderson, you gave birth on that day too, didn't you? That means you have a child the same age as me." I realized something was off. Mrs. Anderson tried to speak, then covered her face with a handkerchief, saying, "I'm sorry." Mr. Anderson spoke instead. "Our child was born but went to heaven. Whether it was because it was too early or the baby was too weak, or maybe both, nobody is to blame. Rather, it's thanks to your father, George Baker, who drove Mary to the hospital right away that our child lived for 3 months. The doctor said that if we had waited for a taxi, the baby might not have survived inside the womb. So we've always been grateful to Mr. Baker, hoping to meet him one day to express our thanks." I was speechless. I couldn't believe such a thing had happened. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know," asked insensitively. "I feel terrible for being so thoughtless. Was what my father did right? Was it not because he drove the car that happened?" I apologized. Mrs. Anderson, crying, said, "No, I hesitated to call an ambulance, and even if I had, we would have had to wait either way. Getting a ride from Mr. Baker was the best thing. The doctor also said so. It's thanks to him that our child could be born, even if only for a short while. We're grateful for that." Tears started flowing from my eyes too. I asked, "May I know your child's name?" "Michael," she said. "We hadn't decided on a name yet since it was still early, but hearing your father named his son Mike, we thought it was a beautiful name. My husband liked it, so we went with Michael, Mike for short." Mary said, "Michael, it's like he's my twin brother." I wiped my tears and said, "So that's right." Mr. Anderson said, "We've always thought of you, whom we never met, as our own son. We hoped he'd live well for Michael's sake. It must be strange to hear us say this." But Mr. Anderson explained, "We never thought you'd join our company. We didn't realize you were the same person because your last name was Wilson. But when your age matched perfectly, and your first name was Mike, we asked Mary to observe you discreetly. She wasn't sure but thought you resembled Mr. Baker, so we decided to ask you. And you were him, which makes us really happy. Thank you. I'm also glad to know this." I felt a mix of happiness and the Andersons' sorrow of losing their child. "Could we meet your father, Mr. Baker, to thank him? If it's difficult, maybe we could send a gift." "What would he like?" Mrs. Anderson asked. "Thank you for your kindness. Actually, my father has already passed away," I informed her. "Oh, I'm so sorry for speaking thoughtlessly. What about your mother?" Mrs. Anderson said apologetically. "Don't worry about it. My mother passed away before him when I was 2, from a heart condition. I don't have many memories of her. My father raised me alone. He died of cancer 3 years ago." I told them. "Oh, I had no idea," Mrs. Anderson said, tears streaming down her face. She reached out to hug me but suddenly pulled back, exclaiming, "No, I'm sorry. I've always thought of you, Mike, whom I knew only by name, with a mother's affection. I impulsively wanted to embrace you like a son when I heard about your misfortune. How embarrassing. I'm really sorry." Hearing this, I responded, "No, I'm grateful that you think of me that way. I'm an adult now but still in my early 20s, and it's lonely without both my parents sometimes. I get melancholic." Mr. Anderson immediately said, "You're not just an employee to us, but like a son. Feel free to rely on us anytime you're in trouble." "Thank you," I said, tears welling up again. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson were also crying. After that incident, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson began to care for me even more. Years passed, and thanks to my hard work, I quickly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a department head. Mr. Anderson even mentioned, "I'd be happy if you could someday be a director of our company." It was still hard to imagine, but I could feel they genuinely thought of me as their son. Moreover, I had another set of parental figures. My wife Sophia's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. Essentially, they were my in-laws. They too treated me like their own son and were always kind to me. Mr. Wilson kept saying, "Our company will be inherited by Mike," which made me feel grateful yet burdened with a heavy responsibility. To be trusted and spoken of in such a way by both the CEO of my wife's father's company and the CEO of the company I currently work for is a testament to their confidence in me, which I find both gratifying and humbling. Sometimes, I even wish there were two of me to meet both CEOs' expectations. However, there's been recent progress concerning the succession of Mr. Wilson's company. Sophia's brother Steve has finally decided to return and take over as co-CEO. Mr. Wilson said, "Steve coming back now, there's no place for him," but I believe that's not what he truly feels. Deep down, he's probably delighted that his son is ready to take over the company. I can tell from Mr. Wilson's words and actions, and I hope for the strong bond of parent and child to prevail. That's why I feel that Wilson Real Estate should be left to Steve to handle. Meanwhile, Sophia and I are expecting a child. Our initial encounter when Sophia helped me during a severe bout of abdominal pain in Thailand, and the connection Mrs. Anderson had with my father when she was pregnant, all these bonds have intertwined to shape who I am today. Michael, who was just a baby, and my own parents who are now in heaven, make me realize that the birth of our new child isn't just our happiness but also a reminder to share gratitude and joy with many. If it's a boy, we could use the letter M in his name like Mark. But what about if it's a girl? As I pondered this, Sophia suggested, "How about Mary?" I replied, "That's a wonderful idea," and we both smiled, happy with the thought.